Okay, I think we're good to go.
All right, awesome. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you guys. Thanks for being here as always. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those who joined recently, I let the folks know who are on early that if you guys need to eat some lunch today, we realize we stole your lunch hour, so feel free to go off camera and eat your lunches or eat your lunches on camera, whatever works best for you guys. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The agenda for today, so we will start with the approval of meeting minutes as usual, and then we'll do a quick review of the public engagement action items that we had from last week. So we'll take a look at the new meeting time for the poll that we sent out for the new meeting time for October 17th. And then just a quick reminder on, making sure that we're getting your contacts either compiled in our contact list or added to Energy Code Board's listserv. After we review the public engagement pieces, we'll pause and make sure nobody had any follow-up questions or anything that came up between our last meeting and this meeting as it relates to the residential provisions of the 2024 IECC. And then the most of today, we're going to spend reviewing the appendices within the 2024 IECC. So before we dive into that review, we're going to turn it over to Adam and David, who are just going to remind us how we are approaching these appendices and how we think we can leverage them to support the low energy and carbon code per the state statute. So we'll just ground everybody in what we think is allowable from the state statute perspective. And then we'll pass it over to Anna for some more great content on the 2024 IECC. So that's where we're headed. Any questions today? Okay, cool. So our meeting objectives follow right in line with our agenda. We would love to walk away with a decided upon time change for that October 17th public engagement meeting. Give you guys the reminder and that ask to please make sure your networks are being engaged in this process. If you guys have any questions on the 2024 IECC, we'll get those answered, and then we'll dive into the appendices. So with that, I will pause and see if there's a motion from the board to approve meeting number 3's meeting minutes.
I'll motion to approve.
Thank you, Ron.
Second.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, all in favor of approving meeting 3's meeting minutes, please unmute and say aye.
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 Wonderful, thank you all. If anyone is opposed to approving meeting number 3 minutes, please unmute and say aye. Wonderful, not hearing any. Meeting number 3 minutes are approved. Thank you, guys. So, like I said, I'm going to quickly review some of our public engagement action items from the last meeting. So thank you to those who completed the poll. I hope most of you guys were able to share your schedules with us through this poll. So as a reminder, the reason we're rescheduling the October 17th meeting is because it will be our second of 3 public engagement sessions. The first one, which will be May 31st, is in the morning from 9 to 11. And so the idea with our second meeting in October is to push it to the afternoon to try to get a larger or perhaps a different group of stakeholders to attend. So looking at the poll results for October 17th, both the 3 to 5 time slot and the 4 to 6 time slot worked for most of the board. 82% that those time slots were tied at 82%. 5 to 7 got a 72% score, and 2 to 4 got the lowest score. So using these poll results, I think it makes the most sense to try to capture the meeting time that worked best for most folks, which would be the 3 to 5 time slot or the 4 to 6 time slot. Some pros and cons to both. 4 to 6 tries to capture some folks outside of that normal 9 to 5 meeting day, but could conflict with some parenting schedules. So I would like to just open it up and see if any one of the board members has a particular preference between the 3 to 5 and 4 to 6. And if you guys want to advocate to your fellow board members around which time we select, yeah, would be happy to kind of hear those thoughts, and we can select a time that works best for the board today. Yeah, Ron.
I would just point out that I would prefer the 3 to 5.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Any thoughts on the 3 to 5 time slot, and if that feels like it addresses our concerns about getting a new group of people or finding a different time for folks to join in the conversation?
Do we need a motion to select a time slot?
I would look to you. I think we could do a majority vote for this. And we'll maybe do that by hand raise.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think we need a motion. We can just we can do
Yeah,
it
I think just go ahead and do it.
Let's
Straw poll it.
let's vote on 3 to 5.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. And Tim, I see your message in the chat. So let's go ahead and if you would like to have the October 17th meeting from 3 to 5 p.m., please raise your hand on Zoom. Okay, thank you, team. I'm just going to see. All right, we've got 12, 13 hands raised. Okay, that is a majority. So thank you, guys. We will go ahead and reschedule that meeting from 3 to 5 p.m. on October 17th. So we'll update that calendar invite so you guys have the right time held on your calendar. Kevin, just making sure you don't have any follow-up questions for us. I also saw you were in the car, so that might just be a leftover hand. Okay,
Nope.
cool.
Sorry, just getting to my desk. Apologies.
All good. Thanks, Kevin. Okay, so then the final piece on public engagement is that I just wanted to remind everybody, we would like you all to use the contact list that we sent out to add contacts from your networks that you'd like us to reach out to or begin reaching out to as we schedule the webinar and send out information about our first engagements as part of this process. The other alternative is that we just ask that you send the listserv sign up link to your contacts if you'd rather not have them in our communal spreadsheet. So between one of the two, please, please, please try to get that done by this Friday. I know how busy everybody is, but we want to start doing outreach around the webinar and our public engagement opportunities sooner than later. So we just want to make sure everybody we're trying to reach has had the opportunity to sign up for communication if they're interested. All right, so that's all I've got on that. Any questions on the listserv or the contact list? Okie dokie, not hearing any. We'll move on. So just wanted to pause here, and I don't think there were no follow-up questions that we grabbed from the last meeting that we that were outstanding that we needed to answer at this meeting, but we just wanted to check and make sure that the board didn't have any follow-up questions on our conversation for residential IECC at our last meeting. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute or raise your hand. And if you don't, we can go ahead and skip this section. Andrew.
I have to apologize. I missed the last meeting. I was out of town, so I do got to go back and look at that video. I may have a question after doing that.
Okay.
But otherwise good.
Great. Well, I appreciate you going back to watch the video, Andrew. And if questions come up, feel free to email myself and Adam. And if there are big questions, we can cover those at the start of our next meeting as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, residential IECC? All right. Well, if they come to you as we go through our meeting, just don't hesitate to ask. But with that, Adam and David, I will pass it over to you guys to just do a quick review of the state statute and what we're working on today.
Sure, thanks. So I think that there was a couple of questions over our last couple of meetings about the whole idea surrounding what we've talked about with these increasing or relaxing stringency of provisions, how that applies to appendices that the board may want to incorporate into the code. And so we just wanted to really revisit this language that's in the statute and just kind of clarify any outstanding questions relating to how that applies, what our interpretation of what that means is. And then we don't actually have a slide for it, but also we'll revisit the question about intermingling provisions of the 2021 and 2024 IECC. So maybe actually I'll start with that one because I think that maybe will lead into this question a little bit more. But so David and I reviewed the statute. We looked at the wording, and I believe it was Carolyn who had brought this up either last meeting or the meeting before about whether or not, if, for the 2024 IECC, there were a couple of sections, the building envelope and fenestration requirement section in particular, that were weakened relative to the 2021 IECC in the 2024. And there was a question of, well, if we want to keep the strengthened version in 2021, but we want everything else in 2024, can we take the 2021 provision and replace the 2024 provision with it? And in our review of the statute, David and I essentially came to the conclusion that no, the statute is pretty clear that you pick one or the other based on which one as a whole is more energy efficient. And so our interpretation is that whichever one we will go with, which is highly likely to be the 2024, we're obviously reserving judgment on that until we see the final 2024 and make sure we are correct in our assessment of the fact that it is more energy efficient, but our interpretation is that it's one or the other. And before we get to Carol and David, did you have anything to add on that?
I don't, other than I don't have the specific language in front of me right now, but I believe it says the more stringent of code A or code B. It doesn't say the more stringent provision of code A or code B, and I think that's what led Adam and me to conclude this. So that's the basis of our thinking.
Awesome, thanks, David. Carolyn?
Yeah, I think I wanted to test that. So I generally agree, with the interpretation. I didn't think we could combine them in a way that creates potentially a more stringent overall code. My big one that I am trying to better understand is this statement here that says, we shall not increase the stringency of any requirements. And yeah. I'm trying to understand what the definition of requirement is in the context of the code, right? So there's,
I think that's where we're going next, Carolyn.
Yeah. So I think we will address that next. I think so.
Okay.
To that point, I think so. When we talked about requirements, so David and I similarly had a discussion of what constitutes a requirement, and I think we essentially narrowed that down to meaning an individual provision that has a specific either prescriptive or performance requirement. So say something requires you to have R30 in a wall cavity or something like that, and you essentially say that is a requirement. That one requirement is a standalone essentially provision, and you cannot say, well, you're going to actually require a higher insulation requirement for that one provision. Essentially, you can't say, well, you're going to go R45 or R49 rather than R30, but you could go down to R13 or something like that for that one requirement. And so I think we're really looking at this at a provision level, in a general sense. I think, as David often says, I think everything, there might be situations where it's well, we can analyze what that might mean in that particular situation. But I think as a broader rule, that's our interpretation of what a requirement is and how you can how you cannot increase the stringency, but can decrease the stringency of it. David?
Yeah, Adam and I talked about this, and just to underline what he ended with there. Yeah, I mean, we're going to need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. You could imagine complicated sort of inside-out language that increasing the stringency or decreasing the stringency isn't super black and white. But generally, what Adam just said is our interpretation of it. Yeah.
And Carolyn, I think so that part of your question also, when we're talking about, because we're talking really at that provision level, that individual requirement level, I think that's where some of the questions too have come around about, well, what does that mean when we're incorporating appendices, right? Because inherently incorporating appendices generally means you're strengthening, right? But I think rather than viewing it as strengthening or weakening provisions, when you're bringing in appendices, you're essentially replacing provisions entirely, right? And the statute is pretty clear that we are allowed to do that. You're either adding new provisions that are, additional requirements that the appendices had, or you're replacing the provision that was originally there with this more stringent version that the appendix had. And that's because that is explicitly allowed in the statute, that would not necessarily fall under that strengthening or weakening. But any provision that isn't implicated as part of the adoption of an appendix, we can't just go arbitrarily say, oh, it says you need 4, well, you need 5, right? Like, we can't go do that. So does that help to answer your questions?
Yeah, no, very helpful. I just wanted to make sure we had clarity around that because I think that interpretation becomes really important. And, just acknowledging that I, just came out of a whole effort looking at EPCA and other things on how you do those trade-offs. And so I just wanted to get that clarity. So appreciate you looking at that. And so I do think maybe for Kim and team, as we go and make our decision between 2021 and 2024, I think they're getting really clear on at the provision level, particularly around items of interest to the board, what those distinctions are, so that we have that to inform our selection of either the 2021 or 2024 as our base.
So I think there may be some helpful clarity here that's needed as well. David and I have, also, reviewed the statute as to what it says between how the essentially baseline code is selected. And from our interpretation, it's really not a choice, right? Like it is what is determined through analysis that determines which code overall is more energy efficient. Like, we're taking the 2021, looking at it entirely, looking at the site EUI, source EUI, like overall energy reduction, and then looking at the 2024 in the same way and saying which one is more restrictive, and that is the one that is selected as a whole. So I just want to make it clear too, like, that's not really a board selection per se.
Well,
let me add that I didn't write this statute, but what I'm hoping is that it becomes really clear and that we're not having to debate too much which one is more efficient.
Yeah, I think it's complex, and I'll just give you my example, and then I'll let Ron go. And I mentioned this, I think, in one of our previous conversations. Like, one of the things that makes the 2024 appear more stringent is the solar requirements. I think from a Colorado context and equity considerations, and some of the other considerations that inform that, I intend to advocate that we remove that section, which may make the 2024 less stringent than the 2021. I have not done that math.
Sure.
And so that's where that's where I'm just trying to noodle around what informs that selection, because is it what we would take that creates the stringency, or is it what's present in the base code that creates that stringency? I think we can work with either. I'm just saying, I just want to make sure that we're clear, so that we know, so that we can address the story as we build it towards our decision making.
Yeah, and I think, Carolyn, just to some extent, I think the way we have read the statute, which, again, to David's point, we didn't write it. It is worded the way it is, and at the end of the day, I think we kind of reviewed it as, like, we're not talking about individual. So, like, we're not saying, well, is the 2024 more energy efficient when you take out these large provisions relative to 2021? Is it as it is published originally more energy efficient? And I would argue too that there are other strategies, and I think, as we will see, I think that's really why the overview of all the appendices is such a critical component of this discussion. And I think maybe this is something we can revisit once that discussion has been had, because I think that will give the board some ideas of, well, we don't like this aspect of the 2024 because we don't think it's as stringent as the 2021. Potentially there are ways to use the 2024 appendices to replace those provisions in the 2024 base code that could perhaps try to address some of those concerns. So I think a lot of this very much is like, we have a lot of different puzzle pieces. And in terms of where we're starting, I think the statute is pretty clear on that. But I think beyond that starting point, it allows a lot of runway for the board to just determine what that path forward is. And so I think that to David's point, I think we also want to avoid getting too caught up into where we start, because there may still be ways to address concerns that you have with that starting point by using other methods that are clearer and are more, more up for board determination rather than, dictated by the statute. So I think that conversation will evolve, and certainly as we have questions about like what can we do going on, like we can continue to revisit this discussion if we need to on every single provision or every single appendix we consider. We can continue to revisit this and make sure that, like, yes, that comports with what the statute requires. But we just, I think, wanted to provide, since there had been some questions about that at a general level, we wanted to provide some guidance about our interpretation of what the statute requires, and then we can still do some of that individual discussion as it goes on, as the process continues. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious when we're trying to do that comparison between the 21 and 24, are we looking at both the commercial and the residential as a paired grouping, or do we look at it in residential 21 to 24 and then the commercial 21 to 24?
That's a great question. I think we would probably have to do it on a like-for-like basis. So we're comparing residential to residential, commercial to commercial. I think the initial analysis does demonstrate that both the 2020, again, understanding, Carolyn, to your point, that some of that is based on what is in the 2024, but that's all we can have. That's all we have to work with at this point. That residential and commercial, both of those provisions are more energy efficient than their counterparts in the 2021. Okay, so I think that is really all we wanted to talk about for this context, and just really wanted to make kind of those general guidelines clear. Again, we can revisit this as needed based on, if there are specific questions about specific provisions or specific things that board members want to advocate for. You can certainly always either ask it in a meeting or email Kim, David, and myself between meetings if there's something you're planning to advocate for that you want to understand. Like, does that fit within the guidelines or the guardrails of the statute? We're always happy to address those questions either in meetings or between meetings. Any other questions on this from anybody? All right, Kim, I think we can move along.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. And I will also flag that as we go through the appendices today, many questions might come up in regards to this. So as they do, definitely raise your hand and ask them, because with that, the rest of the time we're going to spend focused on the appendix review. So Anna, over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Let's get started. We're going to start with the commercial appendices. So first, what we're going to go over is the changes that were made by the board in moving some of the provisions that were in the 2024 main text of the IECC, and they were moved into appendices. Thank you. So we will, thank you, Adam, for that clarification. So we will go through these changes, and then we will get into the appendices that were previously listed as appendices. So first, all of the demand responsive control requirements were moved to appendices. So section C403.4.6 that required demand responsive controls for electric heating and cooling systems. So think heat pumps or electric heating coils. Require an automatic increase of cooling set points by 1 to 4 degrees and an automatic decrease of heating set points by 1 to 4 degrees. So that is now an appendix. Same goes for demand responsive water heating. If you have an electric storage water heater, you are required to have demand responsive controls. And that is also now an appendix. Same goes for lighting. Section C405.2.8, an 80% reduction of lighting power upon signal receipt from the utility is now an appendix as well. Go ahead, Adam.
Just a question about whether or not this requires only the capability to be demand response, like that it must be demand response capable, or does it require any involvement in an active utility demand response program if there's one available?
Just the capability.
Okay, thanks.
Next slide. Section C405.16, which was that electric energy storage system that we talked about a couple meetings ago. So either providing electric energy storage capacity on site or the infrastructure for future electric energy storage. That section has now been moved into an appendix. Any questions on that one? I'm not going to go into too much depth. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I guess maybe once we see the actual language, some more questions will come up, but I see the bullet point size for on-site PV system. It's going to be kind of hard to do without knowing what's going to be provided or proposed for that. But it's almost like a weird statement to say size when you don't even know what you're putting in. But I know it just says it needs to be infrastructure provided. I'm looking forward to seeing this exact language because it doesn't, this section doesn't make a lot of sense.
So this is a really high level, and we're waiting to see what the actual appendix language says. I don't know if they're moving the whole section word for word, but the intent of this was to size an electric energy storage system for the mandatory PV system that's going to be provided on site. So that 0.75 watts per square foot of conditioned floor area. So you have each project would have the opportunity, if you guys adopted this appendix, you would have the opportunity to essentially provide the energy storage system required sized for the PV system that is mandatory in the 2024 IECC, or provide future storage, so square footage in the building, as well as the required electric infrastructure. So they could essentially haul in some batteries, provide the fans for ventilation, and plug them in, and they should be good to go. Does that clear it up a little bit for you? Okay. Section C406.1.1.1, buildings without heat pumps. This has been moved to an appendix as well. So any building using non-electric purchased energy for heating or service hot water, or any buildings with non-heat pump electric storage water heaters would be required to achieve at least 1.25 times the number of efficiency credits listed in section C406. So this was essentially, this appendix penalizes projects that are not using heat pumps for heating into providing additional energy efficiency in their designs. Go ahead, Adam.
Would this have also applied for space heating that is resistance, because it just says non-electric purchased energy. It doesn't say for the space heating that it had to be a heat pump, whereas it does say it had to be explicitly a heat pump for the water heating. So
you're right.
Just wanted to clarify.
It's just if they're using natural gas for heating, for space heating, they would have to comply with this. If they use an electric coil for space heating, they would not have to comply with this. As it's currently written, asterisk until we get the official final language.
Sure. And do you have a sense for now? I mean, I think this is one of the provisions that a lot of folks just out there in the public were really concerned was going to have an impact on the energy savings of the commercial provisions. Do we have a sense for what kind of impact the removal of this from the base code had on that? Like, was this kind of the big piece that would have affected any kind of energy performance of the commercial chapter, or were there other things too?
There are definitely other things. So, this definitely encourages additional energy efficiency for buildings that are using natural gas or electric storage water heaters. you know, when we're looking at the total energy efficiency of the 2024, we are trying to understand and kind of, especially when we're looking at section C406, pick what we think, what pathways we think projects will take. And there are numerous now, as we went through in a couple meetings ago, all those different provisions of section C406. So there are additional efficiency measures. I think what the removal of this provision does is now those credits that were previously weighted, you know, you'll see in section C406, heat pumps have more energy efficient heat pumps have more credits assigned to them than, for example, condensing boilers, right? So there's that benefit that kind of makes natural gas fueled buildings, fueled heating need to achieve additional energy efficiency. But I think this 1.25 factor was included in those calculations. So I'm not sure how the removal of this will impact the credits assigned to each individual category. Does that make sense? It would make it, in my opinion, just my opinion, so asterisk, the potential points available for natural gas water condensing boilers or other additional efficiency measures for natural gas water heating or space heating, those points should be updated to reflect the removal of this section. But I don't know if that's what they'll do.
Yeah, I mean, I think based on some of the discussions we've had about the complex calculations that go into developing those point values, that doesn't sound like they have a lot of time to kind of redo a lot of that work in order to determine that. So, I mean, obviously we won't know for sure until they actually publish the final code, but I wonder if they will go back and actually reevaluate that. My guess is they probably won't, but
yeah, that'll be interesting to see. Okay, so there are a couple of appendices that we've skipped from presenting here because they are more aligned with the electric ready and provisions for Colorado and, you know, the electric charging, vehicle charging and electric ready, as well as the solar ready provisions and appendices in the IECC. We'll be presenting those later. So these are just additional appendices that could be considered. So Appendix CC is the zero energy commercial building provision. The intent here is to require new renewable energy generation when new buildings add electric load to the grid. So if you are requiring electricity for your building or fossil fuels for your building, this appendix would require renewable energy to offset that energy use. Exceptions are to buildings 3 stories and less in height above grade, 1 and 2 family dwellings, and then buildings that use neither electricity nor fossil fuel. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. So how does this tie in with the new requirement for on-site renewable energy, which was in the base code?
Great
this almost
question.
looks like it ends up the exceptions now. At least, well, I mean, commercial, we're not typically seeing 1 and 2 family dwellings or townhomes, but in terms of the R2, 3 stories and less.
So those group R2 buildings 3 stories and less are not covered under section C. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the section number for the on-site renewables for the mandatory section. Sorry, give me 1 second to pull that up for you. But that those buildings also would not be covered under the mandatory PV section.
Okay, because that's in that residential portion. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Carolyn. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think we have residential doesn't have the on-site renewable requirements in that chapter, Tim.
Correct.
Yes, this just acknowledges the commercial segment. Okay, that's helpful. And I just wanted to name this because I went back and looked at the slide deck from the first meeting around our requirements to exempt. Allow for exemption from the renewable energy requirements. So just naming this as like an optional appendix we may want to, at least bring in for jurisdictions that want to retain, what I said earlier in this meeting about not preserving the renewable energy requirements.
All right, next slide. So in this appendix, the renewable energy shall meet the prescriptive requirements listed below. And so these are showing the kilowatt hours per square foot of conditioned and semi-heated area per year. So for example, in climate zone 5B, a restaurant would be required to have 125 kilowatt hours of renewable production per square foot per year. And this is a supplement to the mandatory this is the total amount of, let me start again. This is the attempting to offset the total annual energy use of the building. So the option is to either comply with this prescriptive table, the 7.5 watts per square foot per year of mandatory renewables would feed into this appendix. So we're just trying to offset the total annual energy use of the building. And the other option would be to comply with the performance pathway. So you would use an energy model to show your estimated annual energy use and offset that total annual energy use, not cost. This is annual energy use. Any questions about that? Great. You'll see that for the colder climate zones, we see a higher requirement for PV just due to their higher annual energy use. Okay, next slide. Oh, go ahead, Adam.
So I think one of the big changes that I was hearing about for this appendix from the 2021 to the 2024 is that a lot of the EUI values, the efficiency side requirements were updated, and like a lot of the EUI values were reevaluated, which obviously then impacted the on-site renewable requirements. So can you speak to kind of what those differences were and how those were modified?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me pull up my little analysis here. Sorry. So the requirements for, if we, for example, look at multifamily in climate zone 5B, the big difference here is that the offsets are listed here in kilowatt hours of production. So you can't just, in the 2021 IECC, they were listed in EUI, and this is listed in required amount of production. So really what we're doing here, it's a little bit hard to do an apples to apples comparison, but we do see a slight reduction in the predicted EUI for the different building types. When we compare, so if it was 100,000 square foot multifamily building under the 2021 Appendix CC, we would be looking at an EUI of 46 in climate zone 5B. And I would have to calculate what EUI exactly they're showing here. We'd have to do some unit conversions, but overall, we're seeing a slight reduction in the predicted EUI.
And the reason I was asking that was only because I've heard some different approaches about, well, maybe folks want to move towards zero energy, but again, due to some of the concerns that Carolyn and others have raised about, well, do we actually want to require on-site renewables? as an offsetting, understanding like what those EUI targets are to essentially make it that zero energy ready equivalent to some degree, I think would be helpful to know, just so it's, you know, and how those EUI thresholds compare to just like what estimated EUI like buildings under the base code would be achieving, so we know like what is the gap here. Like, are we talking about we're going from an EUI for a multifamily building of, you know, 80 under the base code, and the zero energy EOI would be like closer to that 46 or whatever the amended version is here? Or is the gap smaller? Is it bigger? You know, just I think understanding like the relative difference here could also be really informative to understanding like, does the board want to consider moving in that direction, similar to what I think it was Louisville. I don't know if Kayla, you could speak to that, but I think that's what they did for commercial buildings, was set those EUI targets.
Yep, we did.
Great. Okay, next slide. So there is an option to provide off-site renewables as well under this appendix. So on-site renewable energy, any on-site renewable energy that you provide to comply with this appendix, the RECs have to be maintained by the building, the owner, or subsequent owners for not less than 15 years. And then if you cannot provide all of the on-site renewables that would be required, you have the opportunity to provide off-site renewables. So there's a bunch of different options here. We have community renewables, renewable energy investment fund, power purchase agreements, direct ownership, the wholesale market for RECs, green retail pricing, or unbundled RECs. If we go to the next slide. There are requirements for each of these different I can never say this word correctly the first time, procurement methods. So if you are purchasing RECs, they have to be created within a 12-month period of use of the REC, and the generating asset has to be constructed no more than 5 years before the issuance of building occupancy. So you can't buy RECs from a asset that was built 10 years ago. It has to be within the last 5 years. And then all those RECs that you are using to offset your energy use have to have been created within a 12-month period of use. Offsite requirements: if you could buy into a community solar garden, it has to either have be connected to your local utility or have a direct connection to the building site. As we pointed out in previous meetings, this is really difficult in Colorado. Just doesn't seem to be very available. Next slide. There are procurement factors based on the type of offsite renewables that you are purchasing. So it has to do with these calculations are completed based on your compliance with section C405.15, which is the mandatory renewables section of the base code. If you do comply, if you do take any of the exceptions from section C405.15, you have a different procurement factor than if you cannot take any of the exceptions from section C405.15 and you're still purchasing offsite. And then unbundled RECs have the lowest procurement factor, so you have to purchase more of them to offset your energy use. Next slide. Okay, any additional questions about Appendix CC before we talk about the glide path? Great. So there were some updates to Appendix CD, which removed the all-electric version of the glide path. So we just now have this one option. So in Appendix CD, this goal, the goal is to increase the energy efficiency of the code and take your code on, they call it the glide path, and you guys are all aware that it is headed towards the net zero new construction by 2030. So there are multiple ways to comply with this in the commercial code. You must comply via the performance pathway or on-site renewable energy generation. The prescriptive pathway has been moved to a resource. So the performance pathway, essentially what you're doing is you are decreasing the energy efficiency of your standard reference design. So the energy model that you are comparing against, you are decreasing the annual energy cost of that building by 3%. So you're making it a little bit more difficult to show the required annual energy cost savings as compared to the baseline. Go ahead on the next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to call out Jesse's comment, which is relating back to a note in the chat that is relating back to the zero energy appendix that as we dive into these discussions, might be helpful to have a primer on all of the offsite options and kind of how they work, maybe a little bit side by side, so that's a little bit easier to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. That could be, we could spend a whole day on that. So they're very complex questions. So then Appendix CD, okay, we're still talking about the glide path. So the other pathway would be additional on-site or off-site renewables. So this is in addition to the mandatory PV in section C405.15. You have to provide this additional capacity factor. So for climate zone 5B, you're providing the additional capacity factor of 2.0 watts per square foot. 6B is 2.3 watts per square foot, and climate zone 7 is 2.6 watts per square foot. You have to be providing a minimum of 10 watts per square foot on site. You can substitute renewable energy generation for additional energy efficiency. So you can show that we are providing really efficient, we're providing like a ground source heat pump system, which is decreasing our annual energy use by X kilowatt hours per year. And that additional energy efficiency offsets the renewables that would have been required on site. Does that make sense? Okay. And there also is a REC pathway for this option as well. Yeah, go to the next slide. That was Appendix CD. Any other questions on the glide path? Great. Okay. Appendix CE is
Anna,
yeah.
Adam, I just heard the pop of a hand.
Oh, thanks, Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question. So now that the prescriptive requirements of CD have been removed to the resource, essentially what this is saying is if the board decided to adopt this provision as it's written now, obviously it could be modified, but as it's written now, essentially the only pathway would be performance unless they come up with another prescriptive or somehow figure out how to, like, how does that work? Because now the prescriptive is gone. It's not like you can just adopt this wholesale without having some challenging impacts.
Yeah, it's performance or just the on-site and off-site renewal, additional on-site and off-site renewables.
Okay.
So agree, it does kind of narrow down the options for buildings to comply. Next slide. Okay, so this is the HVAC TSPR, Total System Performance Ratio appendix. And essentially, as we talked about a couple of meetings ago, the TSPR pathway, which is section C409 of the Energy Code, allows buildings a additional pathway for compliance with section C403, which is the HVAC section. So you can show the HVAC efficiency of your building through this TSPR calculation. It is a ratio of the sum of a building's annual heating and cooling load to the annual energy cost used by the HVAC systems. So it requires a really simple energy model. You have to still create zones. You have to build your building in an energy model. You can't just, it's not just a spreadsheet calculation, but there is some energy modeling required. And there are specific programs that can do this. And you are, modeling the building's thermal envelope and lighting and all of those loads. And you must use the on-site weather file. A larger TSPR indicates a more efficient HVAC system. So that's kind of our understanding of TSPR. And to be honest, I have not calculated a TSPR for any of my buildings. I know that, and I believe it's Washington uses it as a pathway for compliance. But this appendix, so section C409, that TSPR pathway, is a pathway in the base code for buildings. This appendix just requires essentially an additional 5% increase in HVAC efficiency. And it would require the TSPR pathway, so this calculation, to show that efficiency. There is not another way to comply with this appendix without calculating your TSPR.
And a quick question on that. So for the 5% increase in HVAC efficiency, is that being factored in as part of the TSPR, or is that like a separate requirement that then you verify the TSPR separately?
So it's part of the TSPR calculation, and there's all of these equations that I didn't want to make you guys like read through. But they have kind of this like overarching intent, because this section is not very like user friendly. I think I read through it 5 times before I was like, oh, that's what they're doing. But at the sum of the intent, it says requires an additional 5% increase in HVAC efficiency.
And I'm assuming that translates to a new TSPR score.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's different based on your climate zone and your occupancy. Go ahead, Tom.
Hi, do you know why they created a new metric, TSPR, rather than use like EUI or ECI?
Yeah, can we go to the next slide? I think I have. Yeah, so the idea here is that TSPR better accounts for the actual loads at the building site. So you have to use the actual building design, the zoning, and the local weather file. The idea here is to better capture, rather than having these kind of strict SEER ratings or IEER ratings that your cooling coils have to meet. You can show additional energy efficiency in your building's HVAC loads, and how the thermal envelope impacts those loads, lighting, and your location impacts how your HVAC system will operate. So they're trying to just get a better picture of compliance with your building's HVAC efficiency, rather than just putting you into these strict buckets that the base code typically that we're used to, basically. Does that answer your question?
But if the costs are different between different areas, or the costs go up or down, seems like it would affect that ratio a lot.
I agree, Tom. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, and maybe I'm revealing maybe too much about my lack of knowledge in the commercial space, but how is this different from, at least on the res side, some of the academic savings for equipment sizing design.
Sorry, so are you saying submitting the load calculations for equipment sizing? Yeah, okay. So what this is doing is we are actually trying to calculate how the HVAC equipment, at what efficiency the HVAC equipment will operate on your site. So HVAC loads tell you that you haven't, completely oversized your DX coil. It's not going to be cycling and just burning up energy. But what this does is it says, okay, my DX coil or my chiller is going to be operating at part load for 75% of the year. And we're going to get a lot of additional energy efficiency out of that chiller. Because of that, we can provide the split systems in the IT rooms that are very minimum efficiency, and it doesn't affect the building's total energy efficiency. Does that make sense? Okay, great. I do want to also say, can we go to the next slide? There are a ton of exceptions. I have about 3 slides worth of exceptions, so I'm not going to just read all of these to you, but I do want to call out some of the big ones that would not be, these are the HVAC system types or the buildings that currently cannot comply with the TSPR calculation. The big one here are package terminal air conditioners or heat pumps that have a cooling capacity greater than 12,000 BTUs, or a common heating source serving both HVAC and service water heating equipment. Existing buildings that do not replace the entire HVAC system are accepted from this section, and then very small buildings as well. Can we go to the next slide? Underfloor and displacement ventilation, HVAC systems, HVAC systems with chilled water supplied by absorption chillers, heat recovery chillers, water-to-water heat pumps, air-to-water heat pumps, or a combination of air and water-cooled chillers on the same chilled water loop cannot comply with this section. HVAC systems served by heating water plants that include heat pumps, air to water or water to water heat pumps cannot comply with this section. Laundry rooms, elevator rooms, mechanical rooms, electrical rooms, all of those HVAC systems cannot be included in the TSPR. Next slide. There's one more. HVAC systems serving locker rooms with more than 2 showers, natatoriums, restaurants and commercial kitchens with a cooking capacity greater than 100,000 BTUs, which, as we know, is not very large. Cafeterias and dining rooms, and then areas of a building with commercial refrigeration, large commercial refrigeration equipment. None of those space types or systems would be permitted to comply with this TSPR calculation. Go ahead, Adam.
Any of these exceptions different than the exceptions that are in C409 for TSPR, or are these in alignment with those?
They are in alignment.
So essentially, essentially you wouldn't have to rewrite all the exceptions. It would just be, you would be updating what the appendix is really doing is just updating that additional 5% efficiency requirement. Yes. Even though it seems like this long, gnarly beast, it really is just, when we get down to the crux of it, I mean, that seems to be like, that's what the real difference is. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. Okay. Great. Next slide. Appendix CF. Adam warned you guys there were a lot of appendices, so we keep going for a while here. Appendix CF just requires additional energy credit packages. This section would replace all of the requirements in section C406. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see a comparison. So up top, we have the section C406 requirement. I picked a few occupancy groups. There are obviously many more listed. So climate zone 5B, 6B, and 7, you can see all of the number of points that are currently required in the base code of the 2024 IECC section C406. And then Appendix CF requirements, you can see the significant increase in the number of points that would be required. If you guys also remember when we talked about the base code about a month ago, we talked about the under section C407 of the base code, buildings are required to show a certain number, a much fewer number of credits, but they still have to show some additional energy credits under section C406, even if they are complying with the performance pathway. And those credit points that number of points has been updated in this appendix as well, but I didn't want to kill you with charts, so it is not included here. Next slide.
All right, I think if I'm not mistaken, Anna, that leads us to the end of our residential section. Commercial section, thank you. And what I wanted to do is just pause before we dive into residential, because I think there are a few less appendices to cover in the residential side of things. Wanted to just pause and ask kind of a temperature check where the board is at in looking at some of these appendices, and know that we will dive deep into these code conversations soon, but I think Adam and I are really interested in understanding, like, where are folks thinking landing, where are you guys thinking landing around these different appendices, and specifically this question, are you guys interested in exploring as an addition to the commercial code as written or amended? So would love to just spend a quick, 5-10 minutes just getting kind of opening the floor and seeing some initial reactions to the board, understanding that we will continue to dive deeper into this, but some initial direction I think will help our team in structuring those code conversations to come. So I might stop sharing so we can all look at each other for a moment. And yeah, if you guys have any thoughts, feel free to jump in. Yeah, Adam, I appreciate that addition to the question. Is there anything that is like, do not want to touch? Yeah, Tim, start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I am not prepared to give you any opinion today. I always say just to be honest, as if like to be dishonest. I love that term. Honestly, I'm sorry. With just getting that short summary, which was done very well, I need to sit down and now take those notes when I get a copy of this PowerPoint and open those up. That I'm pretty sure those are all in the draft. Try to figure out where each one impacted everything. And so, I can say I would need at least until the next meeting to be able to give you my opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Rob?
Yep, I'll echo Tim's position that it's a lot of water to drink from the fire hose. But on the one thing that did come up with the DR capability, I think it's important to clarify what DR capable actually means, because just because a technology is DR capable doesn't mean it's necessarily compliant with our DR system. And so if it isn't compliant with if we ultimately can't control it, even though it is technically feasible of being demand responsive, does that necessarily mean that it's demand responsive for our definition? So that's something I think that we will need we're going to be providing the demand response capabilities. So I think we are a long way from offering input on it, but we're going to have some input to offer on it.
Yeah, Rob, I appreciate those thoughts, and that also brings up for me, if we do investigate that capability as part of the low energy and carbon code and the need for it to be utility specific, does that then get into like product selection concerns? Choosing one over the other. Yeah, Ron.
I guess I'm thinking that, you know, in the interest of making a code that's readily usable across the state, I'd be a little hesitant of introducing some of these appendices that bring in whole new ways of thinking about how to measure, quantify, and model energy consumption. You know, I think it probably has worked in those jurisdictions that have used something like that. But I'm a little hesitant to just introduce something like that into a market that has not been talking about energy consumption in commercial buildings in that manner.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I definitely appreciate that. And that kind of gets at Kevin's note, which I'll just call out in the chat here. Curious to know how other board members or how board members in climate zones other than 5 consider some of these appendices. You know, sort of looking to our board members here that represent folks outside the Front Range zones.
I guess that's where I come in. But I agree. I need a lot of time to process this. I'm a lot more familiar with the residential applications, and so commercials just even commercial systems are, you know, beyond my immediate expertise. So I'll have to digest that. I do think that some of the solar and glide path pieces around zero energy are a lot more palpable. They're things that a lot of our communities are sort of already on the path towards, but I would 100% agree with Ron around introducing new ways of energy modeling that we haven't yet been talking about. I mean, even EUIs are really, I think we're still really just feeling that out. So a whole new system or a whole new energy model would be aggressive.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Kevin?
The one thing that strikes me as fairly easy to accept are the demand responsive controls, but it'd be good to have the folks that are representing the trade organizations, the contracting side of things, to say how much, because I appreciated somebody's question about is that just prepared for that? Is it like ready to plug into a grid? And that's going to be a very different situation if it's Excel or an REA. So it's easy on its face value to say, oh, that's a good idea because it's going to save energy. But the complexities of how that actually gets realized in the field, in construction, and in different districts, I'm not clear on.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Carolyn?
Yeah, I think to Kevin's point, I have a lot of interest in elements of these for something that could be more of an optional appendix strategy rather than a base code requirement. You know, thinking about how we can provide tools to jurisdictions who maybe want to adopt the optional appendices to go above, and you know, demand response would be things that we would want to encourage. Some of the energy storage would be something that we could encourage through something, you know, more like a either optional appendices or through the additional points kind of strategies that are in some of the, you know, some of the versions of the code, right? To think about how you provide flexibility and not be too prescriptive in areas that may not be broadly suitable across the entirety of the state, and just think about those tools as more either optional or a big menu of things that could easily be adopted and leveraged.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. And I just want to call out Kim's comment in the chat from the southwest corner of the state, and familiar with mountain communities, just agreeing with Jesse that yeah, it would be better to understand these in more detail, these newer appendices. One piece that I did want to mention that Adam and I had talked about offline is, I think it was brought up at an early Energy Code Board meeting, was a consideration around a preferred approach that was taken out of the base code. And I guess just an observation as we went through today's presentation, it seems like there are a couple of opportunities through some of these appendices that could be leveraged for an electric preferred approach, whether that be the what was it, CF? Let me go back. This one. CF or the one that was written specifically around heat pumps. So I just did want to mention that as an observation because I think that was flagged as a potential interest from the Energy Code Board, but welcome any pushback on that. Absolutely.
I'll just say I agree, Kim. I think we want to look at both electric preferred and then optional electric, all electric appendices.
And I will just note too that Anna didn't talk about the all electric appendix because there is no longer an all electric appendix, but that language, even though it is no longer an appendix, could be, as we've discussed in, I think, last meeting, if the board wanted to look at that language to include as an optional appendix back, essentially restore its status as an appendix that would be optional for jurisdictions, obviously not part of our base code requirements, but optional. That's something that the board could do. So if you all want to do that, and so you want to review some of the all electric appendix language, we can certainly bring that back into the fold, but that's just why we didn't bring it up today.
Yes, please put that on the list to bring back into the fold at a later date. I don't think it's critical for our core discussion, but I think we should name it as something that we want to visit and look at it as an optional appendix.
Awesome. All right, any final thoughts from board members before we shift over to our residential appendices? All right, great. Well, I appreciate the early insights and just letting us pick your guys' brain on where you guys are at. Obviously, as the code gets released and all of these specifics get ironed out, we'll be able to dive deeper into all of the pieces. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. So would it be appropriate then to put an agenda item on our next meeting to revisit? And I'm sure possibly we're going to be doing the same thing after we get done looking at the residential appendices, to give us time to digest it, come up with some good input for both of those on that next meeting, so we can at least get that out of the way. Is that the idea?
Yeah, Adam, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, Tim, I think we might want to give it a couple of meetings, just because I think it would be really valuable to have the final code, and we don't have that yet, because I think there are some of the questions about, like, I mean, I think you even made the point earlier of, well, I'd love to see what the actual final language is that's actually either included in the appendix or included in the base code. And otherwise, a lot of it is relatively speculative. And so I think for that, when we're starting to get into some of those deeper discussions about like what is of interest, it would be helpful. Like, we think a lot of it is going to be just what was in the draft, but we don't know that for absolute certain, right? And so I think maybe that's a conversation that might happen maybe 2 meetings from now, because I think we're hoping to get that final code in early to mid-May sometime, and the digital version anyway. So
good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to add to Adam's point and just recognize that given we don't have the final code, we appreciate you guys kind of sticking with us through all of these introductory and informational meetings. We promise there's intention behind all of these. We're not just buying time till that code comes out. But yeah, it's a good input on today's discussion. So anyway, Anna, I will pass it back to you for the residential appendices.
Okay, so here we go with residential. So a few things were moved from the base code to appendices. Again, demand responsive water heating, electric storage water heaters are required to have demand responsive controls will be an appendix. And then here are some other appendices. So Appendix RC, zero net energy residential building provision. The only compliance pathway for this one is through an ERI calculation. So they have to meet all of the mandatory requirements from the ERI pathway section R406, as well as some additional ones. So the building thermal envelope, UA, must be multiplied by 1.15, basically meaning the building envelope must be 15% better than the code prescribed values. And then they have to meet additional ERI calculation requirements, which are listed on the next slide. Okay, so I have a comparison here between section R406 in the 2024 as well as Appendix RC. So based on your climate zone, you have an ERI, different ERIs available. The first does not include on-site renewables, or you'll see OPP, on-site power production. I never get there. It takes me a while. It took me a while to burn that one in my brain. And then the second column is ERI with on-site renewables. Under Appendix RC, those ERI goals have changed. So without including on-site renewables, the ERI is 42, and with on-site renewables, the ERI is 0.
And I just had wanted to call out Carolyn's note in the chat really quick on RC. Be interested in analysis comparing the 15% envelope requirement to the 2021 base code envelope.
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
And then I had a quick question. So I remember this was work that Kayla, when we were working together on Louisville, there being an issue with the Appendix RC and the use of ERI as the only option for that. And I think it was amended out in Louisville, and Kayla, correct me if I'm wrong, to be a HERS score, because that seemed to be the only way to get compliance. Is that factored in here? Is that anything changed with that?
Not that I'm aware of, that they haven't fixed that problem. And Kayla, I think you can speak to it in a little bit more depth than I can, about what Louisville's solution in creating the HERS score. But essentially, we were having contractors say that we could not get an ERI score of 0. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, since I happen to have a project running in Louisville right now, and it's an interesting one because our project actually has a combo. There's some townhomes, and then there's some like low-rise multifamily, 3-story kind of thing. They've determined for this project that the townhomes are going to have to stick with Appendix RC, and under that option, our target is 47. So where here it says 42, our target is 47, and it's really hard. I don't know how we would get to 42. It's without renewables. That's just really tough. And then they dropped it for the multifamily and are just having the multifamily follow Boulder's code, basically. So we're doing a target EUI. And I don't know if that's fully written up, but that was my direction from just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, just to emphasize what Elizabeth said, I think if there's any consideration of these of this appendix, we should get feedback specifically on what the target scores would be most appropriate, because our experience is well, 45 is really hard. 47, you can take maybe 2 reallys off of that. Anytime you cross that 50 threshold, it seems to be particularly challenging.
Ron?
I'm just trying to wonder if is your question also trying to get at this thing that goes on between the difference between a HERS score and an ERI score? Was that part of what you were asking about?
Go ahead, Kim.
I am not sort of very well versed in what the issue was. I just recall that by way of running the 2 ERI and the HERS, you could get a building to a HERS of 0, but it was impossible to get a building to the ERI of 0. And that caused a bunch of chaos in Louisville. So Ron, I don't know how to answer your question because I am not as well versed in these different scores likely as you are, but that was where my question was coming from.
Yeah, it's been a bit of an ongoing mess since the ERI pathway was first introduced, that the ERI scores and the HERS scores don't line up. They've been fighting back and forth. Primarily about ventilation rate has been the biggest piece of that, and the standard, and it's just been going round and round. So in Boulder County, we've been sort of treating them as interchangeable, even though they're not. And in the next version of the code, we'll actually redefine things a little bit to be more specific. So when we're using them, they in fact will be forced to be the same because we're going to prescribe ventilation standard and an ANSI standard that bring those two things back in alignment. And that's a strategy that that Robbie Schwartz helped me figure out the language for, and he's been proposing that to a variety of other jurisdictions around the Front Range.
Awesome. Thanks for that context, Ron. Yeah, and it's interesting that, you know, as Anna said, this is the only pathway it seems available in the current code. So yeah, absolutely. It's helpful.
And Ron, I would also maybe just offer that if you want to send us Robbie's language, that would certainly be
I'd be happy to do
useful
that.
to have.
Yeah, happy to do that.
I'll just chime in that we've had similar complications with updating our codes down here because we use HERS scores as homes get larger to help reduce energy use in those larger homes. So we've had to really be careful to be clear that HERS score is the requirement, not ERI, and make those amendments as appropriate so that it's clear to the contractors and in the code.
I would echo the same for us.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Go to the next slide. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
On that question or comment, I believe 2 other states, Texas and North Carolina, have permitted the use of the HERS index in lieu of the ERI. Is that a question that has come up or should come up?
I think, Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think isn't that kind of what Robbie was, and you were just talking about what you were working on?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you know, when the provision first was proposed in the code of the ERI pathway, it was called the HERS pathway, and then they had to change from that because that was a proprietary name, and they wanted anyone who made software that produced that met the ANSI standard could meet this. But there was just a little bit of a disjunct in the timing, and the two programs have been just tripping over themselves every cycle since then. So originally the goal was that it was one and the same, but we've never been able to achieve that.
No, they'll likely continue to trip over each other. I recall the ventilation being the first hiccup. No, maybe I didn't fully hear that. Is it your intent to permit both as a compliance path?
In my opinion, the ideal thing is that you have them line up so that you prescribe how they're supposed to be modeled, so that you get the same score regardless of which way what you're calling it. That there shouldn't be a divergent in score between the HERS score and the ERI score. You should get the same thing both ways, ideally.
Conceptually, I think that would be true, but it doesn't seem to be true. And I don't know if the ANSI consensus process in the 24 and the 27, along with ResNet, can actually achieve that.
Yeah, I'll share the language that we've been working on, and that might help illuminate the conversation a little bit.
No, it would. I just do recall Texas has permitted it. There's a clear path, and I think North Carolina has also. And I don't know what their language looks like versus what the language is that you're getting from Robbie. But it may, at least for the board purposes, to look at Texas and North Carolina as possible alternate language.
Yeah, we can do some research into that, Andrew, and get back to you all on that.
No, thank you.
Absolutely.
Great. The next appendix is RD, which is the electric energy storage provisions. So again, this is very similar language to what we talked about under the commercial portion of the code. So it would be, you can either comply with providing the electrical storage system for any PV that is provided on site. You'll remember the residential code does not have mandatory on-site PV. The alternate compliance path would be to provide future space for the electric system electric storage system. And then it must also have the required infrastructure. So you'll be requiring panel space, conduit, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. So how would this appendix align with the current residential electrical ready provisions that we've already done in phase 1?
So this appendix requires electric energy storage, which I believe the electric ready residential provisions do not require, that you guys have already approved, correct?
Yeah, so I think, Tim, it would just be additive. It would be an additional requirement to provide the physical space at a minimum for the storage ready. Obviously, there's also the storage required piece that we would have to deal with, but the storage ready alternate option, I think, would be an additive one, whatever. can't say that word apparently, but it would be one that would go in addition to what our requirements are.
So in other words, there's 2 bullet points. Excuse me. It would be one or the other.
Correct.
So the second bullet points alternate is, I think what you just said, required space and electrical infrastructure. And that would only come into play if for some reason, well, we're not going to be requiring on-site solar on residential side, since that got stripped out, right?
So if there was on-site solar being used to comply with the code, there are 2 pathways would be, because you can take energy savings for your on-site solar, right? Through the ERI pathway, through the performance pathway, the prescriptive pathway, you can provide on-site solar to provide additional energy efficiency for your code compliance.
Okay.
Your 2 options, if you all adopted this appendix, would be to either provide electric energy storage for that PV system that you are using to comply with the code, or to provide space and electric infrastructure for future electric energy storage system.
Yeah, what a weird, I'm sorry. I mean, who's gonna pick? Never mind. Thank you.
I think we brought this up last time when we talked about this like a month and a half ago, Tim, where because of the way it's written, it's essentially an energy storage readiness requirement. And then, oh, by the way, instead of doing that, you could just install the energy storage. But it's kind of like it's written to be like the reverse of that, as if like, oh, well, you could just do the energy storage ready instead. And that to me seems like, well, that's really the requirement. And then you can do a stronger thing to exceed the requirement if you want. So it's like written backwards, kind of.
Totally agree. Thank you.
And I had a quick clarifying question to build on Tim's. So the intent says where solar ready is required, it would trigger this. So if our 2021 code with the solar ready, Colorado's new minimum requires solar readiness, for every building that's required to be solar ready and we adopted this, would that also trigger energy storage ready without the PV system?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a great point. Thank you for clarifying. Appendix RF is the alternative building thermal envelope insulation R-value options. It's a long title, but essentially they are providing a large amount of tables that designers can use to calculate additional compliance pathways for wall assemblies to comply with the prescriptive maximum U factors listed in the residential code. Currently, they are only providing tables for wood framed walls, and then the other wall assembly types just say reserved. We'll see if those are fleshed out in the when we receive the fully written code. So Appendix RG is the stretch code. So this is the intent of this appendix is to reduce energy usage via performance, ERI, or prescriptive pathway. So under the performance pathway, you would require 25% annual energy cost savings for all electric dwelling units and 30% for any others, so mixed fuel. An additional 5% cost savings would be needed for dwelling units greater than 5,000 square feet. ERI pathways, so you would require lower maximum ERI values. We would lower the ERI without OPP by 5, and the ERI with OPP would be lowered by 8. And this is from those ERIs that we saw in section R406. Yes, not the Appendix RC ERIs. And then the prescriptive pathway, we would double the credits needed to comply to 20 credits. So previously in the base code section R408 requires 10 credits. There would be an additional 5 credits needed for dwelling units greater than 5,000 square feet. Appendix RA. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
Thanks. Would that 5,000 square feet be conditioned? Is that
Correct.
language in there?
Conditioned. Appendix RH, operational carbon rating and energy reporting. So there are 2 pathways for this. I'm sorry, there's 1 pathway. You have to report your operational carbon and energy usage, but in order to comply with this appendix, you would have to comply via the ERI calculation and CO2e index. So you would be achieving a carbon emissions index of 65 for an all-electric building, not including any OPP. And that target varies greatly varies more for mixed use dwelling units based on the climate zone. So really now we're not only just looking at the energy efficiency on site, but we're also looking at the carbon emissions using regional carbon emission data from, it's RMPP, but our region's annual carbon emissions values. I believe they use the 2021 values to calculate the CO2e of your dwelling unit.
Anna, maybe just a quick question here, just to verify that this is only reporting, right? It's not actually requiring you to do anything to minimize your emission, your operational carbon emissions. It's just saying you must report what they are.
You have to meet the
You have to meet it, that index.
that CO2e index in design. You do not have to show compliance year after year. Okay. Is that your question?
Yeah.
And then just a quick follow-up on that. For the mixed use CO2e index, are they generally higher, generally lower across the board?
They are, sorry, let me pull it up here. This one I have read through a few times. And it says for mixed fuel dwelling units, a maximum CO2e index established at time of adoption of this appendix by the authority having jurisdiction based on the CO2e emissions data specific to the jurisdiction. So you all would be responsible for setting that CO2e target for mixed fuel dwelling units. Thank you for asking that clarifying question, Kim. Appendix RI, on-site renewable energy. So this would require on-site renewable energy for the residential code. 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses would require a 2 kW system. And then group R2 or R4 would require 0.75 watts per square foot of conditioned area. There are exceptions if you have solar water heating, if you are in climate zone 8, buildings where the potential solar zone is less than 300 square feet. So for example, you are building next to a high rise and you are always shaded. And then there are alternate compliance pathways for ERI with OPP or REX, or showing that additional energy performance of the dwelling unit reduces the energy use of the dwelling unit so much that it offsets this required PV. So again, you provide that ground source heat pump system, you are saving X kilowatt hours per year, and that is the amount of PV that would have been required under this appendix. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. Was this one of the appendices that was pulled out? I don't have that other list of what the ICC, this was an added appendix only.
This was always an appendix under the residential provisions. There was never mandatory PV, or maybe under draft 1. But in the second draft of the IECC that we're working off of, this was always an appendix and was not in the base code.
So this would end up matching pretty much on the commercial side, roughly.
Similar. Yes, very similar.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I think, Anna, that is my last slide I've got for you. On the residential appendices. So we're going to move to a similar question as we had for the commercial. But before we do that, any lingering questions for Anna on the residential appendices? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So yeah, let's move to our question. Upon a very cursory initial review, are there any appendices that the board is interested in exploring as an addition to the residential code, whether it be as written or amended? Carolyn, and then we'll go to Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think per our discussion, there's, some space for a stretch code or, more of a zero ready appendix that would be of interest, as opposed to moving that into base code. I think, a lot of what we're seeing in both the commercial and residential around the solar provisions, and we can talk about those in more detail at a later date, but having implemented things that embed solar requirements in code compliance, there's a lot of complexity to that I just want to make sure we plan for adequate time to discuss. Those who drafted code never tried to live with the consequences of implementing those solar provisions, like I think Ron and our Boulder team have been doing for some time, as far as how you attach power purchase agreements or other things to property, and what happens over time. And so just want to say that we're definitely not excited to lean into any of the solar provisions within those, but but where they're seated, there's elements of interest in terms of at least optional appendices.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. Rob.
Yeah, I think that for any of these appendices that we would consider dig into the model code, I think we would have a problem if any of these, if any amendments or any appendices or changes to these appendices that didn't take energy out of the system and just change how it got dumped into the system. I think we'd want to, I'm not sure that that's something we want to, that we want to be careful about. I think it's more important that we take it out, we change how it's dumped in.
Thanks, Rob. And reading between the lines with take it out, efficiency, dump it in, renewables. Okay, awesome. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. Well, both on the residential and the commercial side, residential being the appendix, for requiring the on-site renewable, and in the commercial, that's now in the, not in the appendix, but in the body of the code. I have real concerns with the additional costs. I know one of the charges that this board is supposed to be considering through the legislation was to consider the costs and the affordability. And, you know, I'm in the process of finishing up a city council memo for a study session that I'm having in a couple weeks to go over what I know of the 2024 IECC, the information I'm getting from this process, and now the upcoming potential where it's going to go. And, you know, so we're getting feedback on the commercial side for on-site renewable, which is, it's a big impact. And now if that appendix for the residential came in, the additional impact, and we keep seeing a lot of push for, I still call it affordable. The term now is attainable housing. And this is going in the wrong direction if we, in my opinion, if we leave in the commercial requirement and add in the residential requirement for on-site renewable, along with all the other more efficiency my opinion is to move down the path of an electric preferred with whatever appendices or the base code. But that's because the cost is going to be there, and it's going to be really, really difficult from economic development standpoint as the jurisdictions slowly adopt this. Some will wait until the last minute. Those are my initial comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Brad?
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, I just want to put in a bit of a plug for demand response, especially on the residential side. I do want to say that it's a very beneficial program to City of Fort Collins Municipal Utility, and would certainly like to hear from Rob if he has some concerns, but I believe Xcel Energy has a residential demand response program as well. So I only see an upside to including demand response, and certainly in the residential.
No notes.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Rob. Awesome. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'll just chime in a little bit more on the renewable energy question, particularly as it relates to residential and multifamily. And on the connection with the utility side, and maybe them kind of echoing what Rob just spoke about. It's definitely a challenge for multifamily in particular, and buildings with multiple meters, where we're trying to attach a solar array to a meter. I mean, pick one, right? And oftentimes you have multiple individual residential meters on a residential building, whether it be townhomes or multifamily or whatever. It's going to be 300 individual meters and not like a single meter that feeds the building. To complicate that, certain utilities will not allow a commercial meter on a low-rise multifamily building, like Colorado Springs Utilities. Trying to get solar on a multifamily building in Colorado Springs is really difficult. They will only allow an exception for affordable housing projects, and you got to jump through some hoops. So there's definitely some complications there. And that could, and I only know about that for Colorado Springs Utilities, but I could certainly see that in other rural areas, there could be some similar challenges with that, just to keep in mind. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'll just add one quick thought. Up in Holy Cross territory, on the western slope, it has sort of been a statement that the CEO has put out that they do not want any more solar on rooftops unless it's directly tied to batteries where they can control the load. And if folks were following the rate case that happened with Holy Cross last year, in effect, I think because they're rapidly approaching their 100% renewable energy target, they're thinking about shifting rates in a way that's very would be very harmful for folks who have PV on site because it basically strips out the incentive that you get on your energy bill from that on-site PV. So as we all are also considering a state with an evolving grid, and many different utilities operating in that space and attempting to get to that 100%, I could see rate changes that could also burden the folks that have put PV on their buildings. Yeah, Will.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, not sure whether everyone is aware of this, but coming out of the proposal that Holy Cross Energy had advanced on net metering and then agreed to take a step back from that, there is a state task force that is made up of folks from the solar industry, utilities, NGOs, local governments, that is having a discussion about the sort of future of solar compensation as we move towards a very highly renewable grid. So unclear exactly what's going to come out of that task force, but there is a broader discussion about how solar compensation may change over time. It goes beyond Holy Cross Energy, and it's probably worth being aware of as we have this discussion about the role of on-site renewables.
Yeah, thanks for that context, Will. Kim.
I'll just chime in that we're having similar discussions down here related to the real value of solar versus it being calculated as either wholesale value or retail value. The actual value is somewhere in between. If anybody has any resources on how to calculate that number, I know there's only a couple states out there that have tried. That might be helpful in this conversation as well as for the state task force. And Will, I'd love to, and if there's anybody I can talk to on that task force, that'd be great. In general, I think that some of the appendices make a lot of sense to include and discuss as we learn more on what that final language is for residential. Some of them may be difficult to implement or enforce, but I think that could also be up to individual jurisdictions as to whether they want to adopt them or not. So that's my 2 cents.
Awesome. Thanks, Kim. All right. Well, I'm getting some general leanings from the board that I will maybe hold off on summarizing because we don't have the final text for the code yet. But I appreciate all of the sharing of where you guys are at and sharing some of the challenges that have cropped up for you guys as we looked at those appendices. Carolyn.
Oh yeah, just to maybe name it more specifically, because you flagged it in my comment in the text. I think to the discussion we had at the beginning of today's meeting around the nuance and envelope between 2021 and 2024 on envelope, I just wanted to say, you know, I'm interested in understanding how that percent envelope increase in the appendices equates to any lost envelope performance that occurred between the 2021 and 2024 base code so that we can talk about it. To be clear, I'm not necessarily advocating for a more stringent envelope, but just seeking to get enough information so that we can have an informed discussion around it. Just acknowledging that I know that there's going to be some stakeholders that, you know, speak to advocate for the more stringent envelope requirements, and we just need to be informed on cost and other implications. And so that's why I just named that particular element as something of particular interest from my perspective.
Based on the slide, the ERI requirements in 24 are higher than they were in 21. That's what you get when you have a code book.
Yeah, no, the ERIs are, but it's more the prescriptive envelope requirements of interest, and it was, you know, the comment we got from you know, one of our observers at the last meeting about the lessening of some of the requirements on between the 2021 and 2024, just so we can have that discussion. I generally agree that the 2024 is more stringent even when you take out the solar overall, but it's that particular nuance I think I'd like to explore.
Yeah, and you know, I was on the IECC 24 envelope subcommittee for residential. And my understanding is that the infiltration requirements, like I voted against the, you know, loosening the thermal requirements, but the envelope requirement, the infiltration requirements, it's my understanding, went up enough to offset some of those differences, because the diminishing returns getting between the energy savings between 49 and 60 aren't huge, because it's asymptotic. And the infiltration is, and infiltration is, I think, more linear in terms of energy savings.
Yeah, and a lot of where my interest stems in, and Adam knows this because we explored this with him when Boulder was updating his code, is less around the new construction, and more about additions and alterations to existing structures when we get into the envelope requirements. In that context, there's embodied carbon considerations and how you can meet some of those that are maybe counterproductive to environmental goals and other things. So I think that's just what I think that's a little bit more of where my flavor is at trying to understand and dive into the envelope aspects within the base codes.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you calling that out specifically, Carolyn. All right, any final thoughts on the residential, the commercial, appendices, anything we've talked about today before we move along to our next steps, and I'll send you guys on your way for the day. Okay, not seeing hands. As always, if questions come up, shoot them over to Adam and I and Anna, and we will get those answered. And if we get any questions between meetings, we will bring those back to the full board at the next meeting. So all I've got for next steps today is just a reminder that our next meeting is Tuesday, April 30th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. During this meeting, our goal is to review different above code standards that are in place across the state of Colorado, so the board can get a fuller picture of what communities in the state are already doing, what communities in the state are already considering as code advancement steps to help kind of guide that direction and discussion for the board. At that point in time, at the next meeting, we're also hoping to have an initial discussion around code directions and gaps for the residential code. I recognize that we recognize that if the code is not out, that conversation may be limited, but we will do our best to try to push forward while we wait for the code and talk at least about key themes to try to get a general sense from the board on which themes we want to focus on versus which areas of the code we might want to let be what they are. So that's what's coming next time. And then as a reminder, as I shared at the beginning of the meeting, please add or share contacts for the webinar stakeholder list by this Friday so that we make sure we're capturing all of those contacts as we begin outreach for those engagement events. And then just looking through my notes on quick items for follow-up, Ron, if you don't mind sharing the language for the HERS ERI syncing, we'll share that out with the board so folks can take a look at that. And I think that was the major flag for resources that I had outlined. So with that, any final questions? Yeah, Adam.
Not so much a question, but I just think, you know, we've really identified here when, you know, in the kind of initial discussion about what do we think about these appendices, that there is a lot of review and evaluation of appendices that folks need to do. So I would just really ask that all of you actually spend some time really thinking through. I think the slides kind of summarize those appendices. We can also certainly make sure that you all have the links to the draft language that's out there, because a lot of the appendix language is already there, and it's probably essentially in its final form as it is, and that's what's going to be in the final code. So I think, you know, over this meeting, and then certainly when we have the next meeting as well, just like I think over those next couple of meetings, if you all between those times can really spend some time digging into some of those appendices and trying to understand what, you know, your perspectives on them and what you might want to bring to the table. I think that's going to be really important to make sure that we have really a focused discussion in the future, because I think it's really easy, as you saw, that there are many appendices. It's kind of easy to talk about these in very high level terms and very general ideas. And I think, you know, at some point we really need to get down into some of the specifics, and that is just going to take some amount of, you know, review and gut checks on those. So I would just really encourage and ask all of you to please spend some time in the next month or so doing that.
Yeah, Kayla.
Yeah, I'll just add, thank you for sending any sort of resources that you could send via email, I think would be really helpful. And then if you are able to think through any sort of kind of guiding questions or anything that would be helpful for us to start thinking about specifically before the next meeting, just so that we can kind of have those questions ahead of time, I think that would really be helpful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that suggestion, Kayla. So we will think about those and build out some guiding questions to help focus you guys' thoughts as you're considering and prepping for our next discussion. And then absolutely we'll send out a link to the draft 2 language along with these slides, and try to highlight in that email if there are sections that are now appendices that were previously in the draft code, where you find those within the draft. Okay, cool. Well, I think that's all I've got for you guys today. So thank you all, as always. Great to see you guys, and we will connect in a couple of weeks. Have a great rest of your weeks.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.